momentarily. Thank you for joining today for Direct Women's webinar, Directors' Perspectives, International Corporate Board Service. My name is Yesenia Chavarria, and I will be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I'm the Administrative and Events Specialist here at Direct Women, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping notes. You should all be able to see the screen now and hear my voice. Attendees, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask questions and we encourage you to do so. Please submit questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom console, not the raise hand or chat features. Feel free to submit questions anytime throughout today's webinar. Today's webinar will be approximately 1 hour with 45 minutes of content, followed by a few minutes of Q&A. Links to our speakers' biographies will be provided in the chat once the program has begun. Lastly, a short survey will be sent at the end of the webinar that we hope you will complete. It is only 4 questions and should take no longer than 2 to 3 minutes tops. With that, I will turn it over to the moderator of today's program, Kim Yapchai. Kim?
Thank you, Yesenia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Directors' Perspectives on International Corporate Board Service. I'm so excited for you to hear from our panelists today. My name is Kim Yapchai, and I am moderator for today's program. I'm Executive VP and Chief Legal Officer at Teichert. I'm a 2022 alumna of the Direct Women Board Institute and a member of the Direct Women Board of Directors. For 18 years, Direct Women has focused on fulfilling its mission to increase the representation of lawyers on corporate boards. Through our programming, Direct Women helps to create a pipeline of legal leaders who can effectively serve in corporate boardrooms. We also serve as a resource for companies seeking qualified board candidates. And I'm pleased to introduce our panelists to you today. First of all, there is Lisa, who's a Group General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of Solvay. She currently serves on the board of PI Industries Limited, based in India. Lisa is a 2021 alumna of the Board Institute. Ulrika is former Managing Director and Counsel of Greenhill and Company. She currently serves on the boards of Greenhill and Société Générale, based in France. Ulrika is a 2012 alumna of the Direct Women Board Institute. And then finally, Elisa Garcia is principal of Red Bee Group. She currently serves on the board of Dollarama, based in Canada. And Elise is a 2011 alumna of the Board Institute. So welcome, ladies, and thank you so much for taking time to share your insights. Before we jump into the substance of International Corporate Board Service, I would love for each of you to sort of share your stories about how each of you got your first board position. Elise, would you mind going first?
Sure. I was serving as Chief Legal Officer of Office Depot at the time, and I had recently gone through the Direct Women Institute. And I was solicited by a search firm in Miami that was putting together a database of board-ready Latinos. I knew that board service was certainly a next step for me, having, been in the boardroom advising and guiding the board for, almost a decade and a half at that time, maybe close to 2 decades. And I knew that becoming a board member would help me become a better C-suite executive and help me to understand kind of what my board needed and wanted. So that directory that the search firm put together actually led to an interview.
Excellent, excellent. The perfect timing, right? All right, Ulrika, would you mind sharing your story next?
Sure. I was not at all deliberate about it at first, I must say. It was not until I really sort of contemplated what would come after being a full-time member of an executive team. that board service sort of popped up on my radar, and it happened to coincide with a Direct Women seminar, and that solidified my thinking. Talking to all the people that I met during the board seminars made me think, you know what, I can do this. And I think it would be interesting. I love learning about new companies and new industries. And it seemed in some ways like the perfect culmination of a lot of the things I had done before.
Mhm. Excellent, excellent. And Lisa, what about your story?
Yeah, sure. Hello. So my first corporate board seat came about because of my role as chief legal officer of a US listed company in the automotive sector, WABCO at the time. And we had global operations and an Indian subsidiary, which had a minority shareholding, which was listed on the Bombay Stock Exchange. So we had a board of directors that had independent directors as well as non-independent. And I was asked to go and join the board to lead it from the company perspective. And actually in India at the time, they had quotas for women on boards. So from my role as GC, as well as being a female, I decided to take the role on the board and support our Indian subsidiary.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm curious, you guys have shared your stories, but when did you really start thinking about an international board seat? Like did it come up in your kindergarten or profile, middle school? Around what time did you start thinking about this? Elise, did you want to go first?
Sure, sure. It was during my second CLO gig. My first CLO gig was with a franchise organization owned by PE that I helped, execute an exit strategy and IPO. But the second CLO job actually had a host of challenges. We had an SEC investigation, a financial restatement, all due to conduct before I joined, an economic downturn, private equity investment, a huge merger, integration, merger of equals, and several CEO and CFO changes. So I saw how the board influenced, guided, and how they made both good and bad decisions. And I thought that I'd be a good board member having had this exposure. But, with respect to international board service, I had a lot of Latin America experience. Prior to being a lawyer, I was a developing country energy analyst and I lived and worked in Latin America. And then I was also regional counsel for a large multinational. So I spent a lot of time in the region, both on the business and legal side. My first language is Spanish, so I was definitely open to an international board and certainly thought it would be, a Spanish or South American board. But it was kind of funny when a Canadian board found me. But they were dipping their toe into Latin America. Dollarama is a large value retailer, think Dollar Tree, Dollar General, but in Canada with, 1,800 plus stores. And they saw their growth engine not in the US, but in Latin America. So they were very interested in my retail experience, my Latin America experience, and just kind of the general business experience. So that's how and when it happened.
Yeah, there you go. Interesting. Ulrika, what about
Yeah.
you? You said it was a
Well,
logical next step, right?
it was, well, and a culmination of all the things I had done in my life up until that point. I mean, in other words, I didn't go out and specifically search for an international board opportunity, but like Elisa, in some ways, I'm Swedish by birth. I lived in Europe, South America, and North America, different countries. I speak 5 languages. I studied international relations in college. My law work was with a large law firm that did a lot of international work. I had a ton of international clients. So the international angle was always there throughout my whole life. And my first board was a domestic board, but my second board was an international board. And they were very specifically looking for, sounds a little bit like a needle in a haystack, but someone who spoke French, ideally European, but someone who understood the regulatory picture in the financial services world in the United States. And so I checked all those boxes, and that is how I came to be on the board of SocGen.
There you go. There you go. So I would say it's never too late to start thinking about it, right? Never too early either is, I think, a good summary. Now, once you get on a board, Lisa, can you tell me, like, what's your experience with lawyer bias, right? When you're seeking an international board position, is it real? Is it just rumor? What's your opinion?
Yeah, and I think it's different in different regions. Certainly from a Europe perspective, I still perceive that there is a sense that if you have a lawyer on the board, it's for them to be a lawyer. And there's still some education around actually it's more the skill sets of being a lawyer, your appreciation of risk and oversight and thinking strategically about problems rather than being there as a lawyer. And I think there's some education there from a European perspective. But for example, on my board in India, they were specifically looking for someone with a governance that they could use to elevate and be much more from a US or a European perspective and really elevate the thinking around governance. So there it was an added value.
Yeah, I think it's similar to Elisa's story. Like a lot of times we see the good, bad, and the ugly in our positions, right? You can
Yeah,
bring that
absolutely.
wisdom. Elisa, what about you next? Any bias that you've experienced?
I didn't really see any lawyer bias. I mean, they were looking for someone, not a lawyer in particular. That Dollarama was looking for someone with the Latin America and the retail experience. But the legal structures in Canada are similar to the U.S. They're equivalent of the SEC and the whole TSX structure, very similar to the New York Stock Exchange structure, was something that I think they appreciated I brought to the table, but I didn't see a bias.
Excellent. Excellent. It's good to hear a positive story. Ulrika?
No, in fact, I would say exactly the opposite, not a bias, but appreciation. So I was fortunate enough to step into the shoes of a retiring board member who also happened to be a lawyer. And she had done a fabulous job of educating the members of the board in how useful it could be to have a lawyer on the board in many different ways. And, while I agree with Lisa, they do, to some extent, think of you as a lawyer. In other words, they're very happy to have someone who they think is looking out for them, which, you are. We're all looking out for each other on a board, in a sense.
Yeah.
Um, but they also, I think, discover that American trained lawyers in particular have a fairly broad sense of their responsibility, if I can put it that way, and they don't tend to think of themselves as being confined to a particular box, but rather think of themselves as someone who needs to think strategically about all of the issues, not just the risk, not just the governance, not just the regulatory stuff, but how do all the pieces fit together and with a commercial mindset. And so I felt like I was very welcome on the board. People appreciated my combination of skills.
Yeah, that's very nice. And it's very similar to what many companies think of a GC as today, right? You're an executive first, a lawyer second,
Yes.
right? No, nice.
It took a
So
long time to get there, though. Being the senior citizen on this panel, it took a long time to get there.
I appreciate that, Lisa. And I do wonder, like in different countries where perhaps the lawyer role has not evolved to that, then there may be more of a bias on a board as well.
Mhm.
So turning to the Board Institute, can each of you help me to understand how you feel that helped you to frame your value proposition? As a past participant, going through that was probably one of the hardest parts of the Institute for me, like not just to frame yourself as just a lawyer and to think bigger and broaden your perspective. So, Ulrika, do you want to start with your story?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I had the same experience doing the Board Institute in that you were really forced to reinvent yourself in a sense. So even for someone like me who had been part of an executive team, senior executive team in a company, as opposed to just being a lawyer in a law firm, there was still a bit of a road of reinvention. But to me, the biggest value of the Direct Women Board Institute was the access to its network. I mean, first of all, I was so impressed by all the women that I met, and I loved hearing all their stories and sort of wondered where they had been all my life. All these women that had done all these fabulous things. But I have to say that my SocGen opportunity came directly from my contact with Direct Women because SocGen turned to a search firm. That search firm knew about Direct Women. It went to the Direct Women website. It searched, and that's how they found me. Honestly.
Yeah, which is wonderful. It's a free tool, and I'm not sure that most companies realize that it's there and they can take advantage of it. Recruiters as well. So, Elisa, do you want to share your story about how it helped you to frame the value proposition?
For sure. I'd never really thought about board service until I was asked to consider joining the Institute. And shortly after that, it certainly became an objective. But when I presented my resume, which I thought was a tremendous resume, showing all my experience and my work prior to being a lawyer, in the developing country world, and it's amazing how the Board Institute helped me totally revamp and relook at my legal GC resume and turn it into, a skills-based resume that tooted my own horn. Not something I think most women lawyers do. And it really helped me talk about myself differently and think about my skills differently.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. And Lisa, how did it
Yeah,
help you to frame your value proposition?
very similar, I think, to Ulrika and Elisa. But for me, the biggest impact it had was really reinforcing that network, and how to really reach out and put yourself in front of people across your entire network. And certainly from my experience in getting the next board seat, it's really about who you're working with, who you know, who connect you with the next person. And that really pays off. And whilst it's good, yes, to have discussions with headhunters and the like, I think it's really being able to demonstrate yourself in person, and that will evolve and you meet people. And so for me, it was the emphasis on networking through Direct Women that
Yeah,
helped.
I agree. And we haven't mentioned this yet, but most board positions are filled through the board's network, not through a
Yeah.
recruiter, right? Which is why that network is so important. And I agree with all of you. The network of Direct Women is so incredibly powerful. I feel like I have to pinch myself every time I'm in the room with, the likes of you. And so it's just, I felt for the first time I found my tribe, to your point, Arika. Like, where were these women? Where have you been all my life? Right? Like, they get me, they understand what I'm trying to do, they're supportive. It's just really, really fabulous. So, Lisa, next question is for you. Like, serving on an international board may not be for everyone. So why do it?
Yeah, for me, and particularly as I look at the board I serve on, which is an Indian listed company. It's a large player in the agrochemical space. Um, the there are a lot of risks and liabilities for an Indian independent board member. It's got very high regulatory burden. The liability is hard. A lot of focus on independent directors. But for me, it was the ability to really add value from an international perspective for a company that wants to expand into new markets, expand its pillars, getting the experience and knowledge of different markets. You can really see you're adding growth to a company, and experience which is not readily available to them. So that for me is just where you can really add value in a new way for a company.
Yeah, spot on. Although I do have to admit, when I told my mother I wanted to get on a board, she was like, why would you want to do that? Like, that's my definition of fun. I think it'd be fabulous, right? To be able to add that value and help a company to grow. But she's in the medical field, so not a lot in common there. So this next question is for all of you. What obstacles, if any, do you face with differences in boardroom culture? How does your international board perhaps differ from a US board? Lisa, why don't you go first?
Elisa?
Yes,
Or Lisa?
Elisa.
Lisa, why don't you go?
Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
go ahead. It's okay.
It's one syllable.
Yeah.
I want to make sure Ulrika answers this one because I know the last question. I remember her answer to that and how, how many board meetings and time zones and all that. I'm very, very fortunate. Canada, where, it's Eastern Canada, it's the same time zone. So I don't have a lot of the issues that these other board members have. But the culture, the board structure and relationship with management at Dollarama is very similar to the U.S. The company had a very large investment by Bain Capital before it went public. So Bain really helped structure the initial board and kind of how they do things. And I was at Domino's Pizza for a number of years, another Bain company. So I'm very, very familiar with the Bain way of doing things. So for me, it was like, putting on an old comfy shoe. Um, but it was, I didn't mention it, but I should have earlier. I was put on the board as the result of a shareholder proposal. They had no women on the board, and one of the shareholders put in a shareholder proposal that they should have to put a woman on the board. And I was the compromise. So culturally, there was, there was some concern. They wanted to make sure that I would fit with the group. I don't want to say the club because it wasn't a club, but they wanted to make sure I understood how they did things. I mean, it's a dollar store, so it's, you don't fly first class, everything is, sandwiches for lunch. And they really wanted to make sure that I would fit in with that culture. So that's
Yeah,
my culture.
that makes sense. That makes sense. Ulrika?
Well, I would say, from my perspective, that sitting on the board of a French company is very different than sitting on the board of a US company for a number of reasons. One of which is that it's a French bank, it's heavily regulated, it's a heavily regulated industry. So the regulatory overlay is very complex. But there are also cultural differences in terms of how people approach the materials, how people approach the meetings themselves. The materials are voluminous. And many of them are in French. So even though a lot of the board meetings, parts of board meetings at least, are in English, a lot of it is still in French. So um, you um, you have to be able to embrace something that is very different. You have to be willing to say, okay, this is not how we might do things where I come from, but I'm the one who needs to adapt. And I think that the cultural differences also show up a little bit in all the interactions that happen outside the formal board meeting. Because as we all know, the board meetings themselves are just a small portion of what directors actually do. There are a ton of dinners and coffee breaks and offline conversations and articles that get shared and things like that. And um, if you are sitting on an international board, You need to be, I think, a little bit more nimble in how you handle those interactions. I mean, if you look at the SOCGEN board, we have Germans, Dutch, Canadians, English. I mean, it's a real mix of people, and they all come from different backgrounds, and somehow we all have to figure out how to do things together.
It's like the UN in there.
It is. It's very global.
Yeah. And Lisa, how does an Indian boardroom culture differ from the US?
Yeah, actually, I have a very similar story from Ulrika there. In India, it's really a lot of the decisions do get made outside of the boardroom. In my first India public company, a lot of my work was actually to sit down and have dinner the night before with the independent chairman and negotiate things like the interim dividend payout. And really, it was important for the chairman that that was agreed up front so that there was not a confrontational discussion within the board, which would have seemed to be inappropriate. And also, if you're talking about evaluations of people, it's better to have that outside of the formal boardroom. So things like that are actually quite important from a cultural sensitivity perspective. And also support in terms of the amount of materials tend to be indeed a lot more regulatory focused in India, really ticking the boxes over what they need to produce, which can be a little bit taxing at times.
Yeah, interesting. So a lot of meetings before the meeting and
Exactly. Yeah.
like you said, seeking alignment, avoiding unnecessary embarrassment and things like that. And again, given the amount of time board members have to spend together in the length of years, right? Those formalities can help keep relationships good. I think
Absolutely.
I just saw Yesenia posted a reminder. Please, if you have questions that you'd like me to answer, I certainly have a whole list of them here, but feel free to post them in the Q&A. I'm monitoring them as we go along. All right. So these are international boards, and we've already, talked a little bit. I mean, other than Canada speaking English, it's pretty easy. But I'm studying Spanish in Duolingo. I think I'm on chapter 34 or something, still a long way to go. But how, is it a requirement? Do you think it's not possible to, be on an international board without it? What are your thoughts, Ulrika?
I think that if you did not speak the language of most of the people who are in the boardroom, you would miss a lot. It might be technically possible to serve on the board, and certainly today there's a plethora of instantaneous translation services that are available, so that what's happening in the boardroom can be translated for you. But so much of the subtext and the water cooler chit chat and jokes around the table and so forth and so on will be in the language of the country where your company is, just by definition. And so if you didn't speak the language, if you couldn't follow that, I think you would miss a lot. I mean, it's a little bit like just having Zoom meetings. I think we've all decided, yeah, they're really practical, but you kind of need to get in a room with people to get to know them, to establish a sense of trust and openness. And I think it's the same thing really with the language. If you lack the language, then the relationship with your other directors and with the management team won't be quite the same.
That's fair. Elise, do you agree?
Well, I'm fortunate. My board does conduct its business in English, and most of the directors are from Toronto, even though the board is headquartered in Montreal. But I do find at the shareholder meeting, it's a dual language, and the chairman has to go back and forth between languages. And I've been doing Duolingo closer to 5 years. I think I have a streak of 2,300 plus days, and my French is getting pretty good. I can't speak it, but I understand a lot, and I do get
Mm-hmm.
some of those jokes now. And it's funny because I've been on the board 10 years, and they've seen my progression, and they've commented positively on it. They're actually
That's great.
thinking of putting in the proxy that I understand French. I told them not to go that far because
No,
that
that's
is important to a company headquartered in Montreal. That is something that the shareholders
mhm.
want to know.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Lisa, what about you?
No, I don't have much more to add. I had the same experience. Obviously, with India, the board is conducted in English, and so I find it important though to have that connection and be able to speak and communicate. But you just made me think, Elisa, of one of the differences between the US boards and international. A lot of the time is the style of AGM that you have. So in the US, my experience has been very much very small, rarely any investors actually showing up. Whereas in Europe, for example, it's a very big show. And in fact, you have formal translators because there's two official languages. So it's really like a meeting of the UN. And it goes on for several hours because by law, you're required to answer every single question that comes up. So it's a very different style from a governance perspective of the AGM.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Ulrika, how do liability and insurance at an international board compare to the US?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think there's been a convergence over the years. Whereas the schemes in Europe, for example, are very different than the schemes in the United States. Boards have had their eyes opened, I think, much more over the recent past, let's say last 10 years, over the potential liabilities of directors. So there's a lot more focus on it than there used to be. And uh, while the schemes differ, and of course, it depends on where you're doing business also, not just where you're located, but where your businesses are. Um, what I have found is that directors are putting aside the formal insurance and indemnification obligations, are much more fluent in the types of protective mechanisms that are available to boards. So, in other words, being very conscious of what goes in the minutes and making sure that there is an audit trail. Those kinds of tools that, regardless of what your formal scheme of protection is, are available to anyone. And so I chalk this up to a convergence of governance systems across the world. I think that things are not as different as they used to be when I started practicing, at least. So that's my view.
And so it sounds like maybe more formality, more documentation, and so on and so forth. Did all of you just, this wasn't a scheduled question, but did all of you ask what the D&O coverage was before you joined the board, or did that come up at all?
Yes. I asked, yeah.
It's in the public documents.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. All right. So let's turn next to compensation or, sort of travel commitment and compensation. Let's start with compensation. Ulrika, how does it differ again from the US?
Yeah, I mean, the schemes are very different. I don't know that much about India or Canada, but certainly in Europe, the general level of compensation for boards of directors tends to be much lower than it is in the US, just like it is for executives, frankly. And the way compensation is allocated also tends to be different. So in France, there is a pot of compensation for the board, and some of that goes to the chairman, and the rest is divided among the other board members based on the number of meetings that they attend and their committee memberships slash chairmanships. So the chairman of the committees, for example, chairwomen, get a little bit more, but then it's how many meetings did you go to? So if you don't go to any meetings, you don't get paid.
Very interesting. Yeah, they're taking attendance. Elisa, what about you?
Very similar structure to the US, board fee, committee fees, and it's very heavily equity focused.
And still like quarterly fee
Yeah.
payments. Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Lisa, how does India differ?
Yeah, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit how Ulrika explained, but first of all, compensation is a lot lower in India, and I think most places outside of the US, board compensation tends to be lower. And also in India, it's not permitted to give stock to independent directors. And
Interesting.
then in terms of how the rest of the fee is structured, it's around a commission based as well as sitting fees. And the commission, there is a pot and it's based on your profits. The allocation is delivered by assessing the performance of individual directors. So in my role as chair of the Nom and GovCo, we have to assess board directors and we can adjust what percentage commission they get based on contribution over the year. So a little bit different.
Interesting. Very
Can I ask
interesting.
Lisa a question?
Yeah.
Lisa, if there's no equity allowed, I mean, are Indian directors, do you represent the shareholder? Is that your job or not?
We do. Yes, as independent, you are representing the minority or the independent shareholders versus when you have a promoter-led company. So you're really there looking after the interests of the minority shareholders.
Excellent. So we just had our first question posted in the Q&A. Tell us about travel costs. You know, there's visions of jet setting to Paris and London and whatnot. How does that work with the company? Elisa, do you want to start?
Oh, no, I want Ulrika to start.
Okay.
Well, so my board meets at least 10 times a year. And in addition to our regular board meetings, we have training sessions approximately once a month. And we also do deep dive travel visits to subsidiaries around the world. So last year, for example, the audit committee and the risk committee on which I sit went to Asia to meet the local management teams and talk to them. This year, we're going to the Czech Republic because we have a subsidiary there. We're going to meet them. So it's a lot of travel. And you know, the meetings tend to be 2 or 3 days long. Um, the training sessions we do over Zoom, but the meetings for the most part I go in person, so I travel a lot. Travel is reimbursed. Obviously, the company has guidelines like all companies do. But before taking on a international board assignment, I think you have to have a really good understanding of what will be expected of you. And you have to be really honest with yourself in terms of your own life and whether those kinds of travel commitments fit in with the rest of your life. You know, what do you have at home that you need to take care of? Can you be gone for 4 or 5 days every month? Um, uh, it can be a lot. And you know, it's a question of how long your term is too. And honestly, even if you have 1 year terms, I mean, you don't want to get on the board and stay on the board for 1 year and then get off because you feel like it was too much travel. You know, it's commitment. You make a commitment and you make a commitment to stay on for some period of time. So
That
that's what
makes a lot of sense. And it's not just it's fine if your cost is covered, right? But if you have to travel to Australia or, somewhere else that it takes a significant time commitment, not only do you have to block off the time for the meetings, but you have to block off the time for the travel as well, right? So Lisa, we know you're flying. Elisa, we know you're flying coach.
I'm fortunate though, I live in South Florida and at least, 6 months out of the year, there are a lot of flights from Fort Lauderdale to Montreal. When I have to go up there in the summer, it's a pain in the butt, but no direct
Yeah.
flights or hard to find. But no, I'm very fortunate. It's not that far. And, I think I don't think it's characteristic necessarily of a Canadian board, but the fact that Bain Capital was the investor and they kind of, they structured how this company was going to operate when it became public. It's very efficient. The board meetings are extremely efficient. The board materials are very efficient. They're not voluminous. And the meetings are a day and a half, so it's really not it's not difficult. It's something I could do when I had a full-time CLO job. Certainly, the type of board that the others are on may not have been, something I could have done back
That
then.
makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Lisa, you're going all the way to India. How does that work?
Yeah, I'm on 12-hour flights. And yes, of course, the company fully reimburse. There's nothing unusual there. But I think Ulrika made a good point about having this honest conversation, not only with yourself, but also with the company and the expectations of the chair and of the management team as well. I'm lucky in that we can do hybrid, but I think some boards and some board meetings where it's just not possible to do that or it's not effective. So you have to be prepared to make those trips and those travel. But I am able to manage a little bit with the hybrid where necessary. But that really involves an agreement and alignment with the company.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, next we have one more planned question, which has to do with parting advice or some fun stories that you guys shared when we were prepping. But just want to encourage everybody, please, if you have a question that you're interested in, a topic we haven't touched on already, or if you'd like us to dive in deeper, please go ahead and put those in the chat. So why don't we, there was one question I had. How do international boards, like, in a US board, I'm always working to keep my directors up to date, help them to understand trends or developing risks or things like that. How does that work with an international board? Is it any different? Ulrika, you mentioned some training sessions that you have.
Yeah, I did. And we have a quite well-developed training program. Part of that is driven by the regulators. There are certain kinds of things that the Fed, for example, requires the board of directors to be trained on. And certain kinds of things, the same thing from the ECB. But our board also, on a regular basis, requests training sessions because financial services, banking is a very rapidly evolving landscape, competitive landscape. And you have all kinds of issues like AI and strategic issues. And there are times when we say, we'd like to have a training session on this because the board, we all want to make sure that we kind of have the same starting point when we're considering some of these issues, and our backgrounds and experiences vary so much that the training sessions are a way for us to all get kind of on the same page.
Excellent. Elisa or Lisa, do you have any other thoughts?
With respect to updating the board, I think we have our normal sort of, quarterly board materials. During COVID, I mean, I'm sure everyone had a different experience, but during COVID, we had a lot more contact because, different jurisdictions were closing down and, and distribution facilities were having issues. So we had more regular board calls. But I find that, we communicate with the chairman a bit more. And really just as a full board, what the company will send us information when they think it's relevant. But for the most part, it hasn't been an issue. Tariffs, we certainly had a few calls about that, but no different than a US board would.
Yeah, in my experience at the moment, we're on an evolution around training. As we do the board evaluation sessions, it starts to become a more important topic for the board members looking to get that training and education, both around the company and competitive landscape, but also the regulatory issues. But it's evolving. It's not yet formalized as a standard part of the agenda.
Interesting. Very interesting. So we had a question submitted. For people with specialized knowledge, so say environmental law or sustainability in the US, are international companies who are doing business in the US looking to put people like that either maybe on a subcommittee or on the board directly, or is there an opportunity to be on the board, from the start? So somebody who has a really deep specialty. Thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I start. So particularly for the industry I'm in, which is in Europe and my India board from a chemical perspective, it has such a high focus around the sustainability and environmental topics that we have a subcommittee focused on that, a committee of the board. Now it's staffed by board members. But it's a very important part, and from a regulatory perspective, with what we see in Europe in particular, it's important. And in fact, during our AGM, we do get questions from shareholders asking about the expertise of the people on the environmental and sustainability committee. So we do have to keep ensuring there is the right expertise. So there's certainly opportunities for that in Europe and India.
And the same is true, absolutely, in Europe. And I think that the evolution that has taken place in the United States has certainly also taken place in Europe, which is boards are much more focused than they used to be on recruiting directors that have expertise that the board needs. They're very conscious of what that expertise is. So, for example, yes, ESG, sustainability, that is a clear need. And understanding information technology and everything that comes with that in the light of cyber threats and AI and all those evolutions, very clear need. So yes, the boards are looking for that kind of expertise, very definitely.
Do you see that coming up in your board, Elisa?
We're a value retailer. I don't think that's our MO for our next board member. We tend to look for folks who are more generalist, really good strategically, and then of course with strong finance skills.
I would just add in with respect to my own board, when you have someone who's a specialist, they still need to be able to look from the broad picture, right? That you can't just stay in that silo, that rabbit hole, and only talk about that. So I think it's great to have a specialist and have some in-depth knowledge, but working to be a more broader advisor, it's important to have that balance. But certainly, many boards, they have a skills matrix, as we were talking about before. And what's really important is to look at that skills matrix, not just for where the company is now, but for where it's going. Mm-hmm. So if they're going to be going in tech and they weren't before, making sure that there's somebody with that sort of background on the board is really helpful. So excellent. Again, if anybody else has questions, feel free to post them in there. But why don't we turn to some fun stories, Elisa, or a piece of advice that you think is really important to give people. Elisa, will you start us off?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about when I was interviewing for my board position. I went to Canada to meet the chairman, the chief marketing officer, who became, the CEO eventually after our CEO retired, the lead director, and maybe two other directors. So 5, 6 people. And again, remember, I was the first woman. They were nervous. So they're taking me out to lunch. We're 5 of us, 6 of us going out to lunch. And we go out to the parking lot and they say, oh, it's really close. And they pull up with one car and all the guys pile in, 5 of them. And it's like, the only spot left is like right in the front kind of middle. So I think they were testing me to see, if I could hang with the boys or roll with the boys. But I did. I got in the car and we went to lunch and they made me the offer. So I think it went well. But you know, they're always testing you. But now, just so you know, there are 4 women other than me on the board. So half the board is women now. And I'm on the Nom and Gov committee, so I hope I can take a little bit of credit for that. And then just a little bit of parting advice. I would say to best position yourself for an international board, get some international experience. Speak another language or 5, and look for companies in the space that you've worked.
Duolingo is going to get a lot of business from this webinar. Ulrika, what about you?
Well, I mean, I think one story I can tell is I recently had dinner with a number of recent college graduates. They were maybe a year or so out of college. And so they'd worked for a year and they were all sort of wondering what was going to come next. And so they quizzed me during dinner about my career. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I find careers are rarely linear. There's a lot of serendipity in what you end up doing. And they sort of kept cocking their heads, going, "Gosh, you did a lot of different things, and you liked all of them." And it's true. I mean, I think I've really benefited from taking the opportunities when they presented themselves, even if it wasn't in the original plan. And I'm very sorry today to see that there's this increasing specialization going on in a lot of professions, including the legal profession. And I understand the business reasons for it. But I would encourage anyone who is interested in a portfolio career or sitting on boards to really get as broad an experience as you can. So when, you know, the managing partner calls up and says, "Gee, we are shorthanded in restructuring. Can you spend 5 months in restructuring?" Say yes. You know, try to learn as much as you can about different industries. Don't be afraid of the numbers. Embrace the numbers. Learn how to read financial statements. Learn about valuation techniques, because you're going to need all that. You know, it's not enough. Even if your company needs a specialist like ESG or whatever, it's not enough to have just done just that. And Kim, I think that was your point. Um, so, so grab the opportunities where you can. Frankly, it makes your career more interesting. And the time you really learn, I think, is when you really have to step outside your comfort zone. And that's what prepares you for something like board service, which really requires you to take a 360-degree view of what your company is doing.
For sure.
Yeah.
And Lisa, I've saved your story for last.
Well, I will say a silly story, but you asked me earlier why do it? Well, in my India board, I just so love the energy, the drive, and the commitment, and that also applies to the shareholders. And in India, you also get a lot of individual shareholders, but they have so much passion and ownership of the company. So this year, for our AGM, it was actually still being held virtually, but shareholders can dial in and actually have a video to ask their questions. And one gentleman dialed in and he was sitting in his rickshaw on the streets of Mumbai, starting to give advice on where to spend capex this year and pointing to the pages in the annual report. But it just shows so much energy and passion, and it's really great. But it was a funny moment.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. You just don't know what's going to happen,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
You have to be able to roll with the punches. And I agree with all of you. I think that is part of the fun and what it intrigues me about an international board is that mixture of different cultures and practices and you know the possibility to learn something from another company that we could bring back here. So thank you for, you know, to all of you for taking the time to share your insights and your stories with us today, Lisa, Ulrika, and Lisa. I just so appreciate. I could talk to you like you know on and on. Also want to thank our audience for listening and for joining us. Hope you will join us for future webinars. And also, hope you can join us for our Sandra Day O'Connor luncheon that's happening in October. I will be there. I hope to see more of you there. By attending today's webinar, you will receive Direct Women's monthly newsletter, and so you can keep up on, when's the time period to apply for the Board Institute, when are other webinars and events happening. And please stay tuned for future webinars and other programs and events. And farewell and take care. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.